As we begin our look at the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, I want us to have an understanding as to why we're doing this and what we hope to gain from it. So in U.S. history, we often talk about slavery. We'll talk about the beginnings of slavery and the growth of slavery. We'll talk about the early abolitionist movement and those that were fighting to end slavery. And we certainly talk about the division that slavery caused in this nation. But what is often left out is the stories of the enslaved people themselves, especially in their own words. And so we are going to look at slavery, and we're going to look at it through the lens of Frederick Douglass in his own words, as he tells what his experience was. We don't want to do what has often been done in the past. We don't want to minimize and ignore the stories of enslaved people. We want to understand that. We want to really fully understand our history. It's not an easy history. It doesn't make anybody comfortable, but it's an important part of our history. If we are to learn the lessons of our history, we have to look at the breadth of it and the depth of it. And we need to understand slavery much better than we do. And so that's what part of what we hope to gain as we look at the amazing life and the very difficult life of Frederick Douglass. So as we look at chapter 1 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, I want to introduce you to some of the key concepts that Douglass is talking about here. So he is introducing a primarily white audience to the realities of slavery. Many people that are going to be reading his book have no real firsthand knowledge of slavery. What they do know, they have heard from white voices and primarily white slave owners. And so you can imagine those stories are not only not telling the realities, but they're distorting reality and making slavery sound like it's not so bad, and that making people think maybe it's okay or maybe it's even a good thing. That's the stories that they're hearing primarily. And so he's dispelling those myths. He's coming against those arguments because there's a lot of arguments that are being presented in this time about why slavery is a good thing or why we should keep slavery. And he wants to approach this book by telling his story, but using it and telling his story in such a way that to dispel those false ideas that slavery is really okay. He does that in chapter 1. He tells the story. He tells a violent and brutal story of somebody getting beaten that is enslaved. And so right away, he starts off with this idea, not that slavery is okay, but that the very nature of slavery is that of violence and brutality. I do omit portions of the story occasionally. Sometimes it's for time's sake. Other times it's just because maybe it's a little bit too brutal. And then, of course, some of the language I also omit when I'm reading the story. I don't want you to think, oh, well, wait a second, maybe it wasn't so bad. Or why is he doing that? Is he doing that to make it sound better? No. You can recognize the brutality of it. You can recognize that the profanity and the language that they used was offensive then as it is now, and that you can recognize those things without you hearing me say it. And so that's why I do that. Then finally, as we read chapter 1 today, and as you listen to it, I want you to pay attention to the different ways that the slave system really worked to dehumanize the enslaved people. Pay attention to the ways that they're trying to stop people from having connections, stop them from being able to connect with each other, connect with family, and just the various ways that they are the dehumanizing impact that this will have on people. So let's read carefully and pay attention as we get into chapter 1. Excerpt from chapter 1. The Bloodstained Gate. I have had 2 masters. My first master's name was Anthony. I do not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which I presume he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. His farms and slaves were under the care of an overseer. The overseer's name was Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cowskin and a heavy cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly that even Master would be enraged at his cruelty and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings which I beheld it. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master, and under the following circumstances. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings, and warned her that she must never let him catch her in the company with a young man, who was paying attention to her belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why my master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in the company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found, from what he said while whipping her, was the chief offense. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope, and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool, and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin, and soon the warm red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in a closet, and dared not venture out till long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she was put to raise the children of the younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation.